It's so funny. Many months ago, when I was contemplating doing a story on higher education in prison, I'll never forget sitting at my kitchen table, and I always watch Super Soul Sunday on Oprah's channel, and I think this is like the 12th season or something. And she'd never had this topic on before, and it was our guest speaker today talking with Oprah. And I said, oh my goodness, it's a sign, it's a sign. This is the story I'm supposed to be doing. His interview just really touched me, and I know it touched many of you as well. And fast forward many months later, here I am by a series of coincidences, and here he is, and I'm so excited to introduce him to you. He is a leading voice in criminal justice reform and the president and co-founder of BeyondPrisons. His memoir, Righting My Wrongs, which you can purchase here today, is a story of redemption told through a stunningly human portrait of what it's like to grow up in the gravitational pull of poverty, violence, fear, and hopelessness. It's an unforgettable tale of forgiveness and second chances, one that reminds us that our worst deeds do not define who we are or what we can contribute to this world. His story has inspired thousands of people and serves as a powerful testament to the power of hope, compassion, and unconditional love. Shaka has traveled from Los Angeles to be with us today. Please welcome Shaka to the stage now.
Give Angela another round of applause. She is by far the most beautiful person who's ever introduced me. So, wow. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for affording me the opportunity to share my story in this space and to meet the incredible men and women of Pioneer Human Services. The work that's being done, like, to me, it's no work that's more important right now in this country. And so I honor you all for the work that you're doing, and I'll continue to support in whatever way I can. I'm a little bit congested, so y'all gotta bear with me. I've been like flying nonstop, so. But I wanna just talk a little bit. So imagine you're 9 years old, you're coming home from school, super excited, because you just scored very high on a test that had you a little worried. And you run into the house, and you're like, Ma, guess what? And before you can even share your good news, your mother turns around and hurls a pot at your head with such force that it shatters the tiles on the back of the wall. That's what it was like growing up in my household. I grew up in a household where my mother beat and emotionally abused all 6 of her children. By the time I reached the age of 14, I decided that I no longer wanted to be subjected to that level of abuse. And so I decided to run away. I was a naive teenager, like many of the young men and women that we find getting caught up in the cycle of incarceration. See, oftentimes we hear the news story, but very rarely do we think about the real story. See, prior to running away, I was an honor roll scholarship student. And what I thought would happen is that somebody would see this smart, handsome, still a little handsome, not like I was back then, kid, and they would take me in and wrap me in a warmth and love and comfort that children are so deserving of. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Instead, I was seduced into the crack cocaine trade by a seasoned street veteran And in every city I've been in throughout this country, they exist. And they lure young, vulnerable men and women in to these cultures that are almost impossible to break out of. In the first 6 months, I experienced every imaginable horror that comes with drug trafficking. My childhood friend was murdered. My older brother was shot. Then my other brother got shot. But I continued on in this culture until 3 years in, on a crisp spring morning, March 8th, 1990, I got into an altercation. And the guy I got into the altercation with rolled up in the car and shot me multiple times. I remember when I got shot, I remember running and thinking to myself, I hope I don't get shot in the back or in the back of my head. When I got back around to the block where I got shot at, we waited for an ambulance that never came. And so my friend ended up taking me to the hospital and dropping me off. He was 18 years old and he had been shot the year prior. When I got to the hospital, they pulled the bullets out with the exception of one, patched me up, and within days I was right back in the same neighborhood. Not one adult thought to ask me how I felt, what I thought, what I was experiencing. And so at the age of 17, I was left to grapple with this volatile cocktail of emotions. And so I returned to my neighborhood, grappling with fear, paranoia, and what I now understand to be post-traumatic stress disorder. When you grow up in a city like Detroit, where we average a murder a day, you can't help but think that the children that grow up in that environment are psychologically traumatized. 16 months after I got shot, I found myself in a similar conflict. And leading up to that conflict, I had begun to run this narrative in my head that said that if I found myself in conflict, I would shoot first as opposed to being shot. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, July 1991, I found myself in that conflict. As the argument escalated, there was a moment where I remember turning to walk into my house. And in that moment, what sounded like the car door opening caused me to turn around. And when I turned around, I fired what turned out to be 4 fatal shots, tragically causing a man's death. I was subsequently arrested, charged with open murder, and sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. When I entered prison, I was bitter, I was angry, and I found myself getting into every type of trouble you can think of. 1 year in, I was sent to maximum security. I was the youngest guy sent to maximum security in Michigan prison. In the first 5 years, I accumulated a total of 25 misconducts that ranged from assault on staff to assault on inmates, dangerous contraband. In fact, I was labeled by the warden as being one of the worst of the worst. But then miracles began to happen. I know some of you don't imagine that a miracle can happen inside of a space like prison, but they did, and they do. The first miracle I experienced was meeting some of the most amazing mentors that I've ever encountered in my life. These are men who are dying in prison, who are serving life sentences in prison and who will never know what it feels like to be free again. But despite this, they saw something in me that was redeemable. And I remember them telling me that I would have a second chance, and I remember arguing with them about this second chance, because at 19, you can barely see 2 weeks down the line, let alone 2 decades. But they always told me, you're gonna get a second chance, and you need to be prepared for that. And so they started giving me books, and then they would ask me questions, and then they would like challenge me because they knew I was stubborn and I liked to argue and debate. And those books opened up my mind to new possibilities. But it wasn't a quick fix. Y'all remember the cartoons where you have like the little devil on one shoulder and the little angel on one shoulder, like on the Bugs Bunny joints back in the day? That's how the characters in books became for me. One in particular, Malcolm X, I read Malcolm X's autobiography, and it was like I would have Malcolm on this shoulder, and then I would have like the street side of me on this shoulder. And so I didn't always do the right thing. The second miracle came in the form of a letter that I received about 6 years into my sentence. And the letter was written by the woman who raised the man I was responsible for killing. When I got her letter, I opened it up, and I began to read it. And in the first paragraph, she outlined how devastated her family was based on my actions. She told me about the husband that I took away from a wife, the father that I took away from children, the son that I took away from her. And I remember I wanted to ball that letter up so bad, because it hurted to come face to face with the reality of my the choices that I had made. But I continued to read it. And in the letter, she told me that she forgave me. And she said she forgave me because she's a woman of faith, and that's what God would want her to do. And not only did she forgive me, she told me that she loved me. So that second miracle began to open up my heart space to feel empathy and compassion in a way that I had never experienced. But again, it wasn't a quick fix. I continued on my journey, getting in more trouble. And about 8 years into my sentence, I ended up in solitary confinement for what turned out to be 4.5 years straight. So for 4.5 years, I lived in a cell that was about a quarter the length of this stage. So imagine this is your life, just this space right here. I can guarantee you that the barbaric conditions in solitary confinement are some of the worst in the world. And it's something that we should be ashamed of because we've allowed it to happen on our watch. Professional psychologists and psychiatrists have stated that within 60 days, most people begin to lose some of their mental faculties. And yet there are men and women right now in this country who are spending incredible amount of years in some of the most barbaric, inhumane conditions you can imagine. And so when I found myself in that environment, every day, watching the madness around me, it made me question the purpose of being human and the purpose of our system. Because what it felt like to me was that our system was designed to break instead of to build up. But I was fortunate. I had an advantage that a lot of the men around me didn't have. I was literate. And that literacy allowed me to read books that challenged me and forced me to think. And so I set my days up in solitary confinement as if I was at university. So every hour I would study a different subject: philosophy, world history, African history. And I began to shift in my thinking. And it was then that the third miracle happened. And it came in the form of another letter. But this time, this letter was from my son. My son sent me a letter, and it was different from any other letter he had ever sent. Because in this letter, for the first time, he addressed why I was in prison. And he wrote me, said, "Dear Dad, my mom told me why you're in prison, for murder." He said, "Dad, don't kill again. Jesus watches what you do. Pray to him." As a father and as a man, those words were devastating, but they were necessary. They shattered the last remnants of hood toughness, prison yard savvy, and they forced me to look at my life in a different way. I had read Plato's Republic, and in one of the dialogues, the apology, Socrates said the unexamined life isn't worth living. And so I began to examine my life, and I began to write, and I began to go back and identify all of the different things I had experienced, all of the levels of abuse, the neglect, and I began to shed baggage that I carried that didn't belong to me, but also began to take responsibility and recognize that though things had happened to me, I still had made poor decisions that landed me in a prison cell. And so I made a commitment to myself. I said, if you're serious about transformation, you have to prove it. You got to prove it to yourself. So I said, write a book in 30 days. Now, I know some of y'all that had to write dissertations, y'all like 30 days, like you tripping. Trust me, if I know, if I knew then what I know now, I would have been like, give yourself like 3 months at least. But I didn't have a smartphone. I didn't have a tablet. I didn't even have a word processor. For like y'all young people in the audience, it's this big thing. You can type on it. Still got the whole QWERTY set up. It's a little different. I had pen and pad, but it wasn't even a regular pen. Because in solitary, they don't allow you to have regular pens because you can stick somebody or they're worried about you doing something to the guards. Give you a real flimsy pen, almost like the inside of a regular pen. And I was like, there's no way possible that I'm going to be able to write a book in 30 days with that. But I took that pen and I began to roll it up in paper. And I had a little bit of experience rolling things up in paper. It's no judgment here, it's just no judgment. But I rolled the pen up and I began to write. And I would do my studies during the day, and then I would write all through the evening. And then when they cut the power off in the cells, I would go stand by the window and just whatever sliver of light in, I would just write. And in 30 days, I had my first book. And it was one of the proudest moments that I had in my life because I realized I never accomplished anything. But then I thought about it, I'm like, well, a book isn't a book until somebody else reads it. And so I made a fish line out of my socks and the toothpaste tube and toilet paper to slide up under the door so somebody else can read it. So I sent the fish line across to my neighbor, and I remember watching him pull the book in. And like when the last piece of the envelope slid from under my door, I had kind of this, what the hell am I thinking moment. Because I realized I just gave this man the only copy of the manuscript I had. I was like, damn it. And so I waited. I waited for him to respond. And finally, after a few hours, he came back to the door and said, "It's one of the best books I've ever read." And I can tell you that my level of excitement went through the roof. But then, like always, reality tends to ground us. I had to step back out of the excitement and think about it. I was like, he in solitary confinement. He probably bored as hell over there. Could have sent them anything over there. Like, hey, I got to see this recipe. He'd be like, oh, this is the best recipe ever. So I had to balance that out a little bit by sending my work out to people who I respected and who I believe would give me honest feedback. And so the first book I sent out to my brother, out of all my brothers, he was the one brother who done things the right way and who I respected for doing them the right way. And so when he gave me that same reaction, I knew that that was a pathway for me, not only to turn my life around, but to impact the lives of young men and women who are growing up in communities similar to how I grew up. And so I started writing. I ended up going on to write several more books. I have a motto, 30 days, 30 to 45 days is typically how long it takes me to write a book. And so I began to write, and then something really painful happened. I fell into the deepest depression I had ever experienced while being incarcerated, because I was in a place that was very limiting when my dream was born, and I couldn't give birth to it. And so I began to work on getting out of solitary confinement, which they told me I would never get out. The warden told me I would never get out. But here's the power of transformation. When it's authentic, even your worst critic can see it. And so I wrote the warden a letter and said, listen, if you give me this second chance, I promise you that you won't regret it. And he responded. He let me out of solitary confinement after 4.5 years. And then it was time to see the parole board. My first parole board hearing was about 60 seconds. And the woman told me she didn't believe that I was fit for society and that I would be a menace if I was ever released. Second parole board hearing went a little different. Attractive parole lady. We flirted. I was like I'm getting out for real now. She feeling me, son. She voted for me to get out. Her partner voted against me. The third person voted against me, second time. I went up a third time after being convinced by my loved ones to go back up. And they finally released me. When I walked out of prison, I didn't walk out of prison with the kind of support that Pioneer Human Services has to offer. And I really want you guys to take this in and absorb this, because the work that you're doing, the donations that you're making, are having profound, incredible impact on lives of people who typically don't get a second chance. When I walked out, they told me that I would be back in prison within 6 months because my kind didn't make it. They were like, what are you going to do? You've been gone for 20 years. It's a different world. And I have to admit, I walked out to a different world. It was the equivalent of Fred Flintstone walking into an episode of the Jetsons. Everything was different. There were smartphones, there were laptops, there were internet. There was internet. Think about that for a moment. When I went to prison, there was no internet. There were cars talking now. Last thing I saw that on was the Knight Rider. Like, this is wow, this is like a whole new world happening here. But they told me I would be back in 6 months. But here's what actually happened. When I got out, I felt like stepping out, I would be able to actually repay my debt to society by working in my community. So I started going to schools immediately, the first week I was out. And it was one of the most heartbreaking experiences I've had because the first school I walked into was in worse condition than any prison I've ever been in. And that spoke volumes to me about how wrong we have things in this country, because we're willing to invest more in incarceration than we are in education. And so I would walk into these schools, and I began to work with young men and women who have been deemed as being troubled. And I used literature, and I used philosophy. And people were like, how are you going to get these kids to read philosophy? I said, I'm going to just change all the names. So instead of it being Glaucome, it's going to be Tyrone. I'm just serious, like that's how I read it in my head. But the kids were responsive to that because they can see themselves in those stories. For that work, I ended up winning what was called the Black Male Engagement Leadership Award. That leadership award led to me getting a fellowship at MIT Media Lab in Cambridge. I followed that fellowship up with a fellowship at Kellogg, Leadership Kellogg, which I just wrapped up last week after 3 years. In the midst of that, I did a talk at TED's 30th anniversary. It's named one of the top talks of 2014. In 2015, I won Manchester University Innovator of the Year Award. I also followed that up with an interview which Angela talked about earlier. And Oprah called and was like, can you be available for an interview? Like, I might make some time for you, Oprah. You know, I'm doing things out here in these streets, got stuff to do. I followed that up with publishing my memoir, republishing it actually, on March the 8th, 2016. And it debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. I then won the NAACP Great Expectations Award and the Ford Men of Courage Award. Even though they told me I would be back in 6 months. And so I share this not to brag. I'm gonna brag a little bit. Just a little bit, about this much. But I share it because I personally don't believe that I'm an anomaly. And I personally believe that if we create the opportunity and the platform for men and women to pursue their higher self and to be their best self, that these outcomes become our norm. And the people in this room right now, the work that you're doing, you're creating that type of platform. There's not one single person in here who hasn't made poor judgment at one point in their life, who hasn't made a mistake, who hasn't said something mean that hurt somebody. It's not one of us in here. Would you want to be held hostage to that one moment for the rest of your life? If the answer is no, then why do we continue to allow people to do it to those who have made a decision like that? We incarcerate more people than anybody else in the world. We make up 5% of the world population. We incarcerate 25% of the world's prison population. Now, I know our country takes great pride in being number one in a lot of things, but I don't think that's one that we can be prideful of. And so as I close, I just want to say, don't underestimate the power of extending empathy and compassion to your fellow citizens. Don't underestimate the power of those dollars that you donate to keep these programs going. I wish I would have had something as robust as Pioneer Human Services when I came home. I wish I would have had the type of community that embraced me and that fought for me. Like, it's nothing more painful than trying to get a house and somebody telling you that you can't live there because you have a felony. Like, that hurts at the core of your being. And so this work matters. You know, we have a choice what kind of men and women we want to re-enter our society. Healthy and whole men and women who have been loved and nurtured back to health, or broken men and women who have been beat down by the system. I believe that the people in this room want the former. Thank y'all for your time. Thank you. I appreciate y'all. Thank you. I appreciate y'all.